I'm in Houston today meeting Estelle Hebron-Jones from the Texas Defender Service. Founded in 1995, this organization is a statewide leader in the fight to end the death penalty. In 2024, they released a report written by Estelle. It explores the racial disparities in the pursuit of death sentences in what some people refer to as the death penalty capital of the world, Harris County, Texas.
My name is Estelle Hebron-Jones. I'm the Director of Special Projects at Texas Defender Service, and my organization authored a report called Arbitrary and Capricious, Examining Racial Disparities in Harris County's Pursuit of Death Sentences.
Where is Harris County exactly, and what makes it so special in the US when it comes to death row?
So Harris County is in Texas. It's where Houston is. Houston's the fourth largest city in the United States, but it has also sent almost 300 people to death row since 1973 and executed 133 people. And so it's known as the death penalty capital of the world for that reason. Of all the death sentences that have come down in Texas, a quarter of them have come from Harris County. And of those, 72% of the people on death that have been sent to death row have been people of color, even though people of color haven't exceeded 20% of the population of Harris County.
Harris County has several hundreds of homicides every year, but every murderer doesn't end up executed. Can you explain to us under which circumstances the death penalty is supposed to be applied?
The death penalty is to be applied, arguably, it's supposed to be in the most aggravated homicide offenses. There are 10 specific things that make something into a capital crime, meaning that it's eligible for the death penalty. And those are listed in the Texas statutes. So things like murder occurring during a robbery, or murder involving multiple people, or a murder involving a police officer or a correctional officer. And so it has to be one of those 10 things. So murder plus something else that makes something eligible for the death penalty.
And the person also has to be a danger in the future for the society or something like that?
It's true, yes. So the person has to be found to be a future danger, and it also has to be found that there's nothing mitigating in terms of whether they should get a death sentence or not. But that only comes after the person is found guilty of capital murder.
Harris County is not a deep conservative part of Texas. It's blue since 2016, and Houston has been a Democrat since 1982. How can you explain that such a Democrat part of the USA is the death penalty capital of the world?
Well, even though, yeah, it's true. Harris County is definitely blue now. And there are still a lot of people on death row. I wouldn't say that a lot of people are currently being sentenced. What we're seeing is that the DA's office is still defending a lot of those sentences. So right now, there are almost 70 people on death row from Harris County, still very overrepresented on death row. And so the thing is that these are cases that came down in the past, most of them, though there are people who've been sentenced more recently. And the DA's office is defending them and not really talking about, these aren't cases that people are thinking about every day because they're going through the appeals and the post-conviction process and federal habeas. So I think that it's because people don't know about what's going on in these cases.
So you mean it's cases that were brought there when it was not Democrat?
Yeah, definitely when things were more conservative and under DAs that were very vocally more conservative and very strongly supportive of the death penalty, for sure.
But the DA today is still very strongly in favor of death penalty in this very Democrat environment. Do you have any explanation about that, or is it like a kind of mystery?
I do think it's kind of a mystery. I wouldn't say so. Current DA is Kim Ogg. In her time, she has presided over several death sentences coming down. Definitely less than her predecessors, but she hasn't shied away from using it. I think that the DA's office now would argue that they're only pursuing death sentences against the worst offenders. I would disagree with that. And but why it's still something that happens? I think it's still Texas at the end of the day, and I think that DAs still feel pressure to act in ways where they can show that they're being tough on crime.
Given that capital punishment is part of the Texas law, to what extent can the Harris County District Attorney influence its implementation? Could they, for instance, decide to cease seeking for the death penalty altogether if they wished?
Oh yeah, they definitely could. So, for example, in Travis County, the DA there has said that he's not pursuing any death sentences during his tenure. That's one way that they can stop. Then the other way is looking at those cases of people who are currently on death row and working potentially with defense teams or collaborating in a way to help discover materials that might indicate some sort of bias in a case. For example, there's the ISIS case where, by mistake, they found in the DA's office materials a charging memo where they indicated that the person's ethnicity or country of origin had a role to play in deciding to pursue a death sentence. So it could be working with the person's lawyers to uncover things like that. It could be not being too adversarial when someone is presenting a case or I guess overly adversarial just for the sake of trying to fight something. When someone shows intellectual disability or someone shows that they would be incompetent to be executed. So there are definitely ways, even when someone has been sentenced, the DA can work with people to improve access to justice and not keep up barriers to that. One of the reasons I think why we do have less death sentences is because DAs don't, there are certain offenses like murder during a robbery where during the 90s, the DA's office pursued something like that more aggressively. So the changing attitudes definitely affect how they want to charge certain cases. So they can definitely take a closer look at what they're doing in deciding whether to charge someone with capital murder or not, because two people can commit a very similar offense, but end up in very different circumstances. And so the DA's office needs to take a look at what factors are influencing whether they want to charge someone more or less severely.
Your report explores the racial disparities in the pursuit of death sentences in Harris County. Can you give us a few general figures that will show those disparities?
Yeah, so since 1976, 72% of the death sentences that have come from Harris County have been on Black people. That comprises 53% of all death sentences that have come from the county. And when you look at the 14-year time period between November 2004 and August 2018, 18 of those sentences have been given just to people of color. And then if you drill down even deeper, 15 of those are just Black men. And then going down even deeper, 20% of those have been overturned due to some sort of error in the conviction. So yes, they're just a small way to look at the disparities we see in sentencing.
Is it possible to get into the details of one specific case that would show the racial bias there can be?
Yeah. So Dwayne Buck was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death in 1997 in Harris County. And during his trial, during the punishment phase, the defense expert, one of the defense experts, Walter Kahano, was on the stand. He testified for Mr. Buck, and then the state cross-examined him. And during that cross-examination, the state asked him whether his race was a factor to be considered and whether he would be a future danger or not. And this was an important question because juries have to answer whether they believe the person is a future danger or not to give the death penalty. So when asked whether race was a factor that influenced whether he would be a future danger, Walter Kahano said yes, that it would. And after this, it was determined that in Mr. Buck's case, as well as a few others that happened before around between 1992 and Mr. Buck's case in 1997, that Walter Kahano had provided similar testimony in case of both Black and Hispanic defendants. And in those cases, the Attorney General confessed error and agreed that relief should be granted. Now, the six of them, the Attorney General kept that promise. However, in Mr. Buck's case, they did not, which is why they had to take the case to the Supreme Court. The Attorney General's office argued that that statement that Dr. Kahano agreeing is just something very, very small. But when the Supreme Court came out with its opinion in February of 2017, they said that some toxins are deadly even in small doses. And that's how Mr. Buck got relief, and he was ultimately resentenced. He did not get the death penalty. And it's a big case in thinking about how even just small, the influence of race can have a big impact, no matter the size of the testimony, or amount of testimony has a big impact on outcomes in cases.
So to be clear, this psychologist said that the fact he was Black was making him potentially more dangerous in the future for the society.
Yes, exactly. And this is, and yeah, you can't use race in making this determination, and it's not something that can be used, and it's not something where there's evidence of that being true as well. And I think to add injury to insult, he was Mr. Buck, in that instance, he was Mr. Buck's expert, so he was a defense expert. Dr. Kahano testified both for the defense and the state, but it doesn't matter who he's testifying for, it was still impermissible.
Yeah, it's crazy that something like this can happen during a trial and nobody really pays attention to it when it happens, and it takes years before the decision is overturned.
Yeah, no, it is crazy, but I think unfortunately that's a symptom of the fact that I think some people actually think those are legitimate beliefs, and I think that's why there have been too many cases where we've seen this kind of thing happening. Dr. Kahano, those 7 cases, those aren't the only cases where he testified. He's testified in many other cases, but they all haven't gotten the same relief as these 7 cases that the Attorney General confessed error in.
According to you, can history explain those racial biases?
Yeah, so Harris County definitely had legalized segregation. We also see it in the creation of important institutions in Houston, like Rice University, which was created for the education of white people. That was specifically in the charter. Looking further back, Harris County was the site of 4 racial terror lynchings between 1882 and 1928. In 1917, there was an unfair military trial where 13 soldiers were found guilty, were sentenced to death for participating in a riot.
Black soldiers, huh?
Yes, 13 Black soldiers. In 1977, Mexican-American Vietnam War veteran Jose Campos Torres was beaten by Harris County Sheriff's officers, and instead of providing medical assistance, they threw him into the bayou and he died. And the officers, they ended up getting probation and a $1 fine.
For a long time, Houston has been fighting against integration, for example, in the schools.
Yeah, and actually today, Harris County schools are still some of the most segregated in the country, and there's been a lot of maneuvering, or historically a lot of maneuvering to try and make it seem like that's not the case. There was a point where Hispanic students were categorized as white for the benefit of making it seem like schools weren't as segregated as they actually were. And I think even you look residentially, historically, a lot of the neighborhoods, they were created by segregation, and we still see those same lines persisting today.
Do you think today's racial bias are a legacy of this past?
We definitely still see racist practices influencing what happens in sentencing today. So as of today, the last 3 death sentences, 2 of them have been people of color. And even though there are fewer sentences than before, when you look at the rate at which people of color are sentenced to death in Harris County, now it's outpacing what it was in the 70s. We've actually seen a greater percentage of people of color being sentenced to death in Harris County.
Can you tell a bit about this district attorney whose email inbox was found to contain numerous racist jokes?
Yes. So Chuck Rosenthal was DA from 2000 to 2008, and during it was an investigation in a federal civil rights lawsuit against the Harris County Sheriff's Office. Some emails came out, racist emails. This was in the beginning of 2008, and in his official email, he had numerous sexist and racist jokes targeting pretty much every group you can. And this is emblematic of an attitude that was in the Harris County District Attorney's office. He'd send really, really crude pictures, very offensive things in his emails. And so that's why he finished serving in 2008 due to the emails that were uncovered. No one would have known about these emails but for this investigation into this federal civil rights issue. If that hadn't happened, most likely no one would have even known that these emails had been sent.
In your report, you mentioned that only 20% of the Houstonians are in favor of the death penalty. But can someone who is against it still serve on a jury?
No. There's this process called death qualification, which happens in jury selection for capital trials. And basically what that means is anyone who's going to serve as a juror in a case where the death penalty might be imposed, they have to agree to be able to impose or make the decisions that would lead to the imposition of a death sentence. So if you are against the death penalty for personal reasons or religion, and you say that you would be unable to give a death sentence, you can't be on a capital murder jury.
Isn't that crazy? Because those juries are supposed to be a representative of the people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But everything is stacked in a way to help move things closer to getting someone a death sentence. It's I wish it were different, but it means that a lot of people are excluded. It means that a lot of the ways that the prosecutors craft their questions are in a way to, even someone might show up saying that they don't have a problem with the death penalty, but by the time the prosecutor has done their questioning, they've gotten them to say something to make it seem like they can't choose a death sentence. And so you end up with a group of people on a jury who are arguably more conservative, and are definitely more willing to impose a death sentence than the general population.
That's crazy. Let's talk now more precisely about jury selection. Your report states that Black people are underrepresented on juries. You provide several specific examples where the Harris County District Attorney's Office struck a significant number of Black potential jurors. Can you please explain this and tell us why they might do that?
There's always been a very tense relationship between people of color and the legal system in all ways. So we know with defendants even. So that's how we see lynchings. When it comes to even being witnesses, it took a long time for people of color to even be able to be a witness against a white person. And so then we see that in juries as well. I think that there is a mistrust of people of color. But and I say that because of Houston and Harris counties has both a Black population, significant Hispanic population, but there's always just been this tension between people of color sitting in judgment or having to make decisions about what happens in a legal case. So I think there's that part of it. Then another part of it is that people of color are generally more, or through research, they're less likely to impose a death sentence. So when the prosecutors are trying to select a jury, they typically want to remove those people, just despite what they say, they just want to remove them because they think that it will harm their chances of getting a death sentence against someone. So during jury selection, they ask questions of the jurors, but what we see when you dig into the data, which means looking at the quality, the character of the questions they're asking specific jurors, you see that there's a markedly different way that the prosecutors question people of color versus white people. Also, how women are questioned as well. And all of that is a strategy to try and find ways to exclude these individuals, and they use they conceal their reasoning for wanting to remove these jurors by trying to build up, I guess, a catalog of reasons that they can use instead of race. Even though when you look at what's happening, you can tell that race is motivating how they're questioning, how they're making these decisions. And this isn't something that is just limited. It's not, this happened a long time ago. Even up until it's happening now. And very recently, there have been reports from people who worked in the Harris County District Attorney's Office about how they were trained to exclude Black jurors, how it was well known and a common practice to exclude Black jurors. It's just that when it became, so in 1986, through the case Batson in Kentucky, it was determined that you can't strike people on the basis of race. It didn't mean that people changed their attitudes about that. It just changed the way they approached excluding people. They knew, okay, I can't use race explicitly, so I'm going to have to come up with some other reason. But when you look at what they're actually doing and you start comparing jurors, you'll find Black juror and a white juror who are pretty much similar on all fronts. Even sometimes the Black juror might express more pro-death penalty views, but when they want to strike the person and they claim it's for this or that reason, but it's like, wait a minute, you kept that person, and the only difference is that this person was white.
If we take a wider look at the county, this county is very diverse. Mm-hmm. Has this diversity been reflected in the political system of the Harris County?
Historically, yes. There hasn't been a representation of people of color in the political system. Now that's definitely different. But I think that even though that has changed, or definitely in leadership, if you look at the mayor of Houston, if you look at who the judges are, there's definitely more representation on the bench, even within the district attorney's office. But a lot of the traditions and practices are still carried down. Like I think it would be, if you know, I can't say, you know, every single prosecutor who does discriminatory practices, they're white. That's not true. But everything is happening within an institution that was created to disenfranchise certain groups of people, and I think that is still definitely part of, and that's why, despite changes in the political landscape now, we still see discriminatory outcomes in the legal system.
Can you tell a few words about how was the political situation here in the 20s?
In the 1920s in Harris County, there were candidates who were propped up by the Ku Klux Klan, who definitely won majorities across the county. Even as late as 1993, we're seeing all white benches, despite there being almost 20% representation of African Americans in the electorate and 20% Hispanic representation. So clearly demonstrating that, even recently, some disparities in the population and the people who are being elected.
Your report points out that racialized testimony and evidence were also featured in some trials in the Harris County court system, right?
Yes, racialized testimony and evidence is definitely part of several trials in Harris County. So, and there are different ways in which this comes out. So there's, of course, or I guess just the impact of racism. So we talked about jury selection, and already when you have a jury selection where there's disparities in the way people are questioned, I think that definitely can have an influence on what happens to how the jurors themselves think about their role and who they are, and the validity of their voices. But when it comes down to what happens in the actual trial, we have cases where the prosecution has emphasized a person's ethnicity or religion, for example. So in the case of Ali Ersan, which is a case that it wasn't actually, it was in Harris County, but a special prosecutor actually handled that case. But in his trial, it was rife with references to Islam and kind of mischaracterizations of it, references to country of origin, and really trying to set up a dynamic where he was othered. We have in the case of Tedrick Batiste, where he was, where some lyrics to some rap songs that he wrote were used to show him as like a callous, cold, remorseless person, even though for him it was a method of expression for him. It was something creative, but in trial it was flipped and used to show him as a hardened gang member who endorsed, all of the kind of stereotypes that come with hip hop. So, those are some examples of, specifically how we see race coming into play. But I think generally any trial in Harris County is going to be influenced by the racial dynamics of the county and of the district attorney's office, and how and the fact that they choose to pursue death sentences almost exclusively against people of color, that influences the way people see who is more dangerous, who is more worthy of more severe sentences. Because if you're only used to seeing, or if you're mostly used to seeing people of color, the ones getting sentenced to death, the one being portrayed as most dangerous, I think that funnels down into how you're going to make your determinations about whether someone is more or less worthy of a death sentence.
And what would be your solutions to improve the Harris County court system? So
I think one of the things that can happen is judges can be trained specifically on implicit bias. The judge controls so much of what happens in a courtroom. They're the gatekeeper of evidence. They control the mood and the tone of what's going on. But if they aren't aware of how bias can impact what's happening in a trial, it means letting a lot of things slide that shouldn't happen. It means not instructing the attorneys to act appropriately. It allows things like, for example, the testimony in Dwayne Buck's case to come into a trial. And so it's really important for judges to be aware of how bias and particularly implicit bias affects what's going on. The other thing that can happen is that the DA's office can the DA's office can be more transparent about how they're choosing to pursue capital charges against certain people, and even just being able to take a look at, okay, well, we have these two different cases. Why did we decide this here and this here? I think is a big step towards changing what's happening, changing how they choose to how much they want to defend certain cases, and like the recommendation for the judges, I think prosecutors, well, not just prosecutors, anyone involved in a capital trial should be made aware of implicit bias. Because again, going back to Dwayne Buck's trial, it was his defense attorney who brought Walter Kahano to testify. This was in 1997. There are the other 6 cases where the attorney general said that there was error. Those happened before that. The defense attorney should have been aware of the type of testimony that Dr. Kahano was providing in trials, and should have known that that potentially he could have testified that way. They should have looked at his report and notes before he was testifying to know that it's possible that he could say that. Other changes could be, there's some wider changes that could happen on a statewide level, including changing death qualification for juries. So then, widening the pool of people who can participate in making decisions in capital murder cases. And then with the people who are still on the road, almost 70 people, many of whom are eligible for death sentences, the DA's office can work with defense attorneys to look at these cases again and identify any possible errors, or identify things that would make someone ineligible for the death penalty. Because there are many people on death row from Harris County who are convicted for offenses that they would never charge in that way now. And so I think it's still worth it to look at these cases and say, oh, okay, and acknowledge we might have pursued these more aggressive charges against this person because they are Black or Hispanic. Or maybe it might not be the case, but they need to be open to looking at and reviewing these cases, because it can definitely move a lot of things forward. Because as I said earlier, the cases from Harris County greatly overrepresent, or the people from Harris County who are on the road are very overrepresented, and there are definitely opportunities to help do the right thing.
The Black people, you mean, are overrepresented.
But even just Black people, Hispanic people, but across the board, just Harris County's number just dwarfs any other county. Travis County is where Austin is, and it's another major city in Texas, in the United States, and the amount of people they have sent to death row, and who are currently on death row, is very small compared to Harris County. Harris County has almost 70 people on death row today. Travis County has, I believe, 4 people on death row today.
Thank you very much for accepting this interview. I really appreciate it. It was very interesting.
Thank you for having me.